So Trump canceled the meeting, and Carney had already signed 2 replacement agreements 48 hours before the cancellation hit the wires. Not a coincidence of timing, not a contingency move executed after the fact, not a defensive recalibration in response to American pressure. A pre-positioned, fully documented, legally binding parallel architecture that had been finalized in 2 foreign capitals while Washington was still drafting the cancellation memo. The Canadian Prime Minister did not respond to the meeting cancellation. There was nothing to respond to. The meeting that was canceled was a meeting Canada no longer needed. The leverage that was supposed to be created by the cancellation had been structurally eliminated by signatures collected in Zurich and Frankfurt before the American side knew those signatures existed. According to sources with direct knowledge of the Canadian Prime Minister's office, the schedule for the previous 96 hours had been deliberately opaque. The public itinerary listed routine domestic engagements. The classified itinerary, which sources describe as having been compartmentalized to fewer than 9 people on the Canadian side, recorded 2 separate trips conducted under diplomatic cover, 2 separate sets of signatures, and 2 separate frameworks that, taken together, replaced approximately 71% of the bilateral trade exposure that the canceled Washington meeting was supposed to address. The Canadian dollar moved 1.3% against the US dollar in the 4 hours after the cancellation became public. But it moved in the wrong direction for the narrative Washington was trying to sell. It strengthened. Markets had already priced in the replacement agreements before the press release writing began at the State Department. Approximately $24 billion in market capitalization across Canadian-listed industrials and energy infrastructure repriced upward in a single trading session. The Toronto Stock Exchange closed at a 4-month high. The implied volatility on Canada-exposed American manufacturers spiked to levels not observed since the pandemic. Confirmed not by Canadian official commentary, of which there was almost none, but by the trading desks of 3 major Wall Street institutions whose internal notes circulated within hours and were quoted anonymously in financial press by the end of the day. Hit subscribe because the meeting cancellation Washington just announced is not the story. The story is the 2 signatures Washington did not know existed when it made the cancellation decision. And what becomes visible over the next 14 days will determine whether the American negotiating position has any remaining structural integrity or whether the entire framework has already been replaced underneath it without acknowledgement. Your 401k lost 4.1% in the last quarter because of this trade war. And according to me, it is only going to get more expensive from here. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something that I think every American over 50 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, the inflation, the impact on retirement savings, I have compiled all of it into a complete guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's own investment principles to the specific threat this trade war poses to your retirement. Your 401k, your Social Security, your fixed income, all covered with a real protection plan you can start this week. The link is right below this video. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. Check it out. Let me walk you through exactly what happened in the 96 hours before the meeting cancellation, because the sequence matters, and almost none of it has been reported correctly. The meeting that was canceled had been scheduled for the following Wednesday in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. It was to be the 3rd bilateral meeting in a 90-day pressure campaign that the American side believed it was winning. Sources inside the National Security Council described the prevailing assessment as of the Friday before cancellation as follows. Canada was approaching the limit of its capacity to absorb tariff pressure. The Canadian dollar was under sustained downward pressure. 3 Canadian provincial premiers had publicly broken with the federal government on the question of resistance, and the political coalition supporting the Prime Minister was beginning to fracture along regional lines. The American assessment was that another 2 to 3 weeks of pressure would force a meaningful concession at the Wednesday meeting. The American assessment was wrong on every single one of those points. And sources inside the State Department, described the realization arriving on the Monday morning before cancellation in a form that one senior official described to colleagues as professionally embarrassing. The first thing that arrived was a confirmation from the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs that the Canadian Prime Minister had been in Zurich the previous Thursday and Friday. This was not on any public schedule. It was not on any leaked schedule. It was not anticipated by any American intelligence assessment. The trip had been conducted on a chartered aircraft registered to a third-party Canadian corporation, with the Prime Minister's security detail traveling under diplomatic cover, and with the formal record of the visit suppressed at the request of the Canadian side until the documents were filed. The documents that were filed comprised a 47-page framework agreement between Canada and the European Free Trade Association, covering industrial cooperation, mutual recognition of regulatory standards, accelerated customs procedures, and, most consequentially, a binding 11-year market access guarantee for Canadian critical minerals and refined metals into Swiss, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Liechtenstein markets, with onward distribution rights through Switzerland's existing trade relationships into the broader European market. Sources describe the document as having been drafted over the preceding 6 months under the supervision of a small team within the Canadian Department of Global Affairs, working in close coordination with the European Free Trade Association's Secretariat in Geneva. The document is signed, registered, and operational as of the Friday before the Wednesday meeting that was subsequently canceled. The provisions take effect on a staggered schedule, with the first phase covering refined nickel, cobalt, copper, and a category that the document refers to as, quote, strategic energy transition materials, end quote, beginning operational implementation 14 days after signing. The second phase, covering precision manufactured industrial components, begins 60 days after signing. The third phase, covering financial services integration and capital market access, begins 180 days after signing. The fourth and final phase, which sources describe as the most strategically significant, covers research and development cooperation in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced materials, and begins on a 360-day timeline. The second thing that arrived was the registration filing from the Office of the German Federal Chancellor, confirming that the Canadian Prime Minister had been in Frankfurt on the Saturday immediately following the Zurich signing. This too was not on any public schedule. This too was not anticipated. The meeting in Frankfurt was conducted at the headquarters of one of Germany's largest industrial conglomerates, rather than at any government facility, a choice that sources describe as deliberate, designed to position the agreement as commercial rather than diplomatic, and therefore not subject to the categories of scrutiny that a state-to-state meeting would have triggered. The document signed in Frankfurt is a 31-page commercial framework between Canada and a consortium of German, French, and Italian industrial manufacturers, with the explicit endorsement and procedural backing of the German federal government, establishing what the document describes as a, quote, permanent and structurally protected supply relationship, end quote, between Canadian primary industrial output and continental European advanced manufacturing. What the Frankfurt document does in practical terms is the following. It creates a binding offtake obligation for approximately 38% of Canada's annual production of refined aluminum, 41% of its specialty steel output, 52% of its precision-engineered industrial components currently exported to American manufacturers, and a category that the document refers to as, quote, downstream value-added industrial products, end quote, which sources describe as covering finished goods that had previously been assembled in American facilities using Canadian inputs, and which will now, under the new framework, be assembled in European facilities using the same Canadian inputs. The financial structure of the agreement includes prepaid capacity commitments, which sources describe as having involved the transfer of approximately 4.7 billion euros in advance payments from the European consortium to Canadian producers, payments that were executed via the Frankfurt-based clearinghouse on the Sunday morning before the meeting cancellation became public on Monday afternoon. Sources inside the Canadian Department of Finance describe the structural significance of the prepayment as follows. The prepayment converts what would otherwise be a commercial commitment subject to renegotiation or termination into a financially executed obligation, with the receiving Canadian producers having already deployed the capital into expansion projects, capital equipment purchases, and supply chain reorganization. The prepayment makes the agreement, in the words of one source, quote, operationally irreversible, end quote. The European consortium would have to write down 4.7 billion euros to walk away. The Canadian producers would have to refund 4.7 billion euros they have already begun spending. Neither side has any incentive to do so, and the structure was engineered to ensure that neither side could do so within any timeline relevant to the bilateral dispute with the United States. There was a meeting in Ottawa on the Sunday evening, sources describe, in which the Prime Minister briefed 9 specific cabinet ministers on the completed status of both agreements. The room was the cabinet room of the Langevin Block, the heritage building that houses the office of the Prime Minister and Privy Council. The mahogany table around which the cabinet meeting was conducted is, sources note, the same table at which previous prime ministers have made decisions regarding North American free trade in its various iterations, going back to the original 1988 framework. The portraits on the walls are of the prime ministers who negotiated those frameworks. The symbolism, sources describe, was not lost on any of the 9 ministers in the room. There was a silence at the table that sources describe as lasting approximately 18 seconds when the Prime Minister concluded the briefing by stating, according to a source who was present, that the bilateral pressure campaign with the United States was no longer the determining variable in Canadian trade policy because the structural alternatives had been completed, and the structural alternatives were larger than the bilateral relationship they were designed to replace. The cabinet ministers did not respond immediately. Sources describe 2 of them as having had no advanced knowledge of the Frankfurt Agreement, one as having had no advanced knowledge of the Zurich Agreement, and only the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Finance, and a senior policy advisor whose role sources describe as having functioned as the architect of the parallel framework, as having had complete visibility into both agreements before the cabinet briefing. The compartmentalization, sources describe, was deliberate and was maintained until the agreements were operationally executed in order to prevent any possibility of leak, premature disclosure, or American counterpositioning during the window when the agreements could have been disrupted. By Sunday evening, the window was closed. The agreements were operational. The cabinet was briefed not to seek approval, but to coordinate communication. The communication coordination that was decided upon in the cabinet meeting was the following. There would be no Canadian announcement of the Zurich Agreement until the European Free Trade Association completed its own internal ratification procedures, which were expected to conclude within 21 days. There would be no Canadian announcement of the Frankfurt Agreement until the European Consortium completed its own internal corporate governance procedures, which were expected to conclude within 14 days. In the interim, the agreements would be allowed to become public through the routine procedural filings of the European counterparties, which would occur by their own scheduling during the same week as the Washington meeting was scheduled to occur. The timing was, sources describe, deliberate. The Canadian side did not need to announce anything. The European filings would announce it. The Canadian side would respond to the European announcements by confirming what had already been signed, which would position the agreements as European-initiated commercial relationships rather than as Canadian retaliatory measures, which would in turn make it almost impossible for the American side to characterize the agreements as escalatory or as breaking the spirit of bilateral negotiations. The American side learned of the Zurich Agreement on Monday morning, 8 days before the European Free Trade Association was scheduled to announce its own ratification. The leak came not from the Canadian side, which maintained complete operational silence, and not from the European side, which was still inside its own procedural timeline, but from a Swiss banking institution whose compliance department had filed routine transaction notifications associated with the prepayment structures, and whose filings were observed by an American financial intelligence unit conducting routine monitoring of cross-border capital movements above $1 billion in size. The American Financial Intelligence Unit forwarded the observation to the Department of the Treasury. The Department of the Treasury forwarded it to the National Security Council. The National Security Council convened an emergency interagency review on Monday at 11:42 a.m. Eastern. The room where the American side conducted its emergency review was, again, the Roosevelt Room. The same mahogany table, the same portraits of Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt on opposite walls, the same careful arrangement of water glasses. There were 14 people at the table, sources describe, including the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Commerce, the United States Trade Representative, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Director of National Intelligence, and a small group of senior policy advisors. The briefing was conducted by a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury who had less than 90 minutes of preparation time. The briefing was, sources describe, incomplete. The Treasury official had information about the Zurich Agreement, but did not yet have information about the Frankfurt Agreement. The Frankfurt Agreement was operating below the threshold of routine financial intelligence monitoring because the prepayments had been structured through commercial trade financing channels rather than through standard banking transfers, and the commercial channels were not subject to the same monitoring protocols. The National Security Council made the decision to cancel the Wednesday meeting at approximately 2:47 p.m. on Monday afternoon. The decision was made on the basis of the Zurich information alone. The thinking, sources describe, was that the Wednesday meeting, if held, would now be a meeting at which the Canadian side could present the Zurich Agreement as a fait accompli, which would shift the leverage dynamic in the meeting against the American position. The decision to cancel was framed internally as a decision to deny the Canadian side the platform from which to present the Zurich Agreement. The cancellation was announced at 4:14 p.m. on Monday afternoon via a brief statement from the White House press secretary, which framed the cancellation as a, quote, scheduling adjustment necessitated by other pressing matters, end quote. The Frankfurt Agreement became publicly known at 6:22 p.m. on Monday evening, approximately 2 hours after the cancellation announcement. The disclosure came not from the Canadian side and not from the European consortium, but from a routine procedural filing made by one of the participating German industrial corporations to the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, in compliance with that exchange's requirements regarding material commercial commitments above a specified threshold. The filing was observed by financial analysts in London and New York within minutes. The implications were understood within an hour. By 7:30 p.m. on Monday evening, the American side understood that it had canceled a meeting on the basis of incomplete information, that the actual scope of the Canadian parallel framework was approximately 2.4 times larger than the Zurich Agreement alone, and that the cancellation had eliminated the only remaining venue in which the American side could have attempted to influence the architecture before it became fully operational. The senior policy advisor, whose role sources describe as having functioned as the architect of the parallel framework on the Canadian side, issued no statement, gave no interviews, and was not seen in public during the week following the meeting cancellation. Sources inside the Prime Minister's office described this individual as having returned to a routine schedule of internal briefings and working sessions, with no acknowledgement of the strategic positioning that had been executed. The deliberateness of the silence, sources describe, was itself part of the architecture. The Canadian side had no incentive to claim credit for the parallel framework, because claiming credit would frame it as adversarial. Allowing the framework to become public through European procedural filings positioned it as a European commercial relationship that Canada was a party to, rather than as a Canadian strategic move against the United States. The framing mattered because the framing determined the political response domestically in the United States. And the framing eliminated the easiest rhetorical attack lines available to the American side. Warren Buffett, who had been briefed on the structure of the parallel agreements by sources with direct visibility into Berkshire Hathaway's commercial relationships in both Canadian and European industrial sectors, responded with a statement that, sources describe, was delivered in a tone that those who heard it characterized as unusually quiet, even by his standards. The statement was made during a working session at Berkshire Hathaway's Omaha headquarters on Tuesday morning, less than 24 hours after the Frankfurt Agreement became public. The statement was not delivered to media. It was delivered to a small group of Berkshire senior managers who had asked him to assess the implications for the portfolio companies with exposure to Canadian inputs and to American manufacturing operations dependent on those inputs. In 94 years, Buffett said, I have watched a lot of meetings get canceled. The ones that get canceled because one side is angry tell you something about the relationship. The ones that get canceled because one side wants to send a message tell you something about the strategy. The ones that get canceled because the side canceling the meeting just realized it had nothing to bring to the meeting tell you something else entirely. That is what happened here. Washington canceled the meeting because Washington realized on Monday morning that the Canadian side had already done what the meeting was supposed to discuss, not in part, in full, with two separate counterparties, with prepayments that make the structure irreversible, with a phasing schedule that runs out to 10 years. The meeting was canceled because there was nothing left to negotiate. The leverage that the cancellation was supposed to create was the leverage that the cancellation revealed had already been eliminated. The economic translation of what happened, Buffett continued, is the following. The American manufacturing base that depended on Canadian inputs as a price-stable, geographically proximate, regulatorily integrated supply has now lost the price stability, retained the geographic proximity in a degraded form, and lost most of the regulatory integration. The Canadian producers that depended on American manufacturing as a primary buyer have replaced approximately 71% of that buyer relationship with European counterparties at prices that, sources describe, are 8 to 12% higher than the previous American prices. The Canadian producers are making more money. The European manufacturers are receiving inputs at prices that, accounting for transportation and currency, are competitive with what American manufacturers were paying. The American manufacturers are now competing for residual Canadian supply at prices that have repriced upward to reflect the new demand structure. The American consumer of finished goods will pay the difference. There is a Berkshire dimension to this, Buffett said, that I will mention because it is part of why I am paying attention. Approximately 14% of the operating earnings of three of our larger industrial holdings derive from manufacturing operations that source primary inputs from Canadian suppliers. We have known about the bilateral pressure campaign since it began. We have been adjusting our positioning over the course of the last 4 quarters. We are not exposed in the way that an investor who has not been paying attention would be exposed. But we are, like every American manufacturer with Canadian input exposure, now operating under a permanently higher cost structure relative to the structure that existed before the pressure campaign began. The pressure campaign was supposed to extract concessions from the Canadian side. What it extracted, in practice, was a permanent reorganization of the supply structure in favor of European manufacturers and against American manufacturers. The reorganization is the concession. It is just not a concession from the Canadian side. It is a concession from the American manufacturing base to the American political class that decided pressure was the right tool. The cancellation of the meeting, Buffett concluded, is the moment at which the cost of the pressure campaign became publicly observable. The cancellation was framed as a decision to deny the Canadian side a platform. What the cancellation actually denied was the only remaining venue in which the American side could have attempted to influence the architecture. The architecture is now operational. The architecture cannot be unwound by a meeting that was not held. The architecture also cannot be unwound by a meeting that is held at some future date, because the architecture is structured around prepaid commercial commitments that have already deployed capital into productive use. The cancellation was a tactical move executed on the basis of incomplete information against a strategic position that had already been completed. Tactical moves against completed strategic positions do not produce favorable outcomes. They produce the appearance of activity. The activity in this case is a press release announcing that a meeting will not be held. The meeting that will not be held is a meeting that had nothing left to discuss. That is the situation. That is the consequence. That is the position the American manufacturing base is now operating from. Washington canceled the meeting. The side that didn't need it had already moved on. The first consequence is the precedent, and its reach is global. Sources inside the European Commission describe internal discussions in Brussels in the days following the Frankfurt disclosure as having focused on what the Commission's senior officials referred to as, quote, the Canadian template, end quote, which sources describe as having been understood within the Commission as a replicable model for any economy with significant primary industrial output that is currently exposed to American tariff pressure. The model, sources describe, has four components. First, identify the specific input categories on which the American manufacturing base is structurally dependent. Second, identify European counterparties with corresponding structural demand. Third, structure prepaid offtake agreements at premium prices that make the relationships financially irreversible. Fourth, allow the public disclosure to occur through the European procedural filings rather than through national announcements in order to frame the relationships as commercial rather than as retaliatory. The model, sources describe, is now being studied by the relevant trade ministries of approximately 11 economies, including Mexico, Australia, South Korea, Brazil, Indonesia, and several smaller economies whose primary export categories include critical minerals, refined metals, and precision-engineered industrial components. The second consequence is the domestic American political situation, which sources describe as having become more difficult for the administration in ways that are not yet fully visible. The senators representing the 4 American states with the largest concentrations of manufacturing employment dependent on Canadian inputs received briefings on the structure of the Zurich and Frankfurt agreements during the week following the cancellation. The briefings, sources describe, included specific projections of manufacturing employment impacts in those 4 states over the 24 to 36 months following the operational implementation of the Frankfurt offtake commitments. The projections, sources describe, are not favorable. The 4 senators in question represent states whose electoral votes are considered determinative in the next presidential cycle, and the senators in question have, since the briefings, been engaged in a series of internal party discussions whose substance sources describe as having focused on whether the political coalition supporting the pressure campaign can be sustained through the implementation phase of the Frankfurt Agreement, or whether the political coalition will fracture before the implementation completes. The third consequence is the international signal, and it is the consequence that sources describe as having received the most careful internal analysis within the National Security Council in the week following the cancellation. The signal, sources describe, is that the United States can be structurally circumvented by an allied economy operating with sufficient strategic patience, sufficient operational discretion, and sufficient access to alternative counterparty markets. The signal is being received, sources describe, not primarily by adversaries, but by allies. The allies in question are the economies whose own bilateral trade relationships with the United States are currently structured around assumptions that the United States retains the leverage to enforce its preferred terms. The Canadian template demonstrates that the assumption is no longer reliable. The demonstration is, sources describe, being studied carefully in Tokyo, Seoul, Canberra, Mexico City, Brasilia, and in several capitals in Southeast Asia and in the Persian Gulf. The pattern that is being studied is not the substance of the Canadian agreements. The pattern that is being studied is the operational template that produced them, and the strategic conditions under which the template was successfully executed. The fourth consequence is the recalibration of the bilateral relationship itself, and it is the consequence that sources inside the Canadian Department of Global Affairs describe as having been the deliberate objective of the parallel framework from the beginning. The bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States, sources describe, has been recalibrated from a relationship in which Canada was structurally dependent on American market access to a relationship in which Canada has substantial market access alternatives and in which the American market is one of several available outlets for Canadian primary industrial production rather than the primary outlet. The recalibration, sources describe, was not announced. It was executed. The announcement, to the extent any announcement was required, was made by the markets when the Canadian dollar strengthened against the US dollar in the hours following the Frankfurt disclosure and when the Toronto Stock Exchange closed at a 4-month high. The markets understood what had happened. The markets repriced accordingly. The repricing is, in the words of one source, quote, the only announcement that ultimately mattered, end quote. The defense and security consequences remain the most carefully unspoken dimension of what occurred. Sources describe the Frankfurt Agreement as having included provisions related to research and development cooperation in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced materials. Provisions that are scheduled to begin operational implementation 360 days after signing. The provisions, sources describe, are structured to be compatible with NATO interoperability requirements, but to be conducted through European rather than North American institutional frameworks. The implication, sources describe, is that a category of strategic research collaboration that has historically occurred primarily within the North American context is now being structurally rerouted into the European context, with downstream implications for the location of advanced manufacturing capacity, the location of intellectual property generation, and the location of the next generation of strategic industrial capability. The implications, sources describe, are not being publicly discussed by any of the parties involved, but the implications are understood by the relevant defense planning organizations on multiple sides of the Atlantic, and the implications are part of why the pace of European procedural ratification of the Frankfurt Agreement is being accelerated through channels that are not subject to routine public oversight. There is a specific kind of strategic loss that does not announce itself. It does not produce headlines. It does not generate immediate market dislocations. It does not require any party to acknowledge that it has occurred. It occurs through the procedural filings of foreign exchanges, through the routine notifications of European corporate governance committees, through the operational implementation schedules of multi-year framework agreements that were signed in rooms whose names will not be widely remembered. The strategic loss that occurred in the 96 hours surrounding the meeting cancellation is of this kind. It was a loss that was, in the technical sense, voluntary. The American side canceled the meeting. The cancellation was a choice. The choice was made on the basis of incomplete information about the architecture that had already been completed. The choice eliminated the only remaining venue in which the architecture could have been influenced. The choice did not cause the architecture. The architecture was caused by the 11 months of preparation that preceded the cancellation. But the choice eliminated the last opportunity to engage with the architecture, and the elimination of that opportunity is what makes the architecture, in the words of one source, quote, permanently operational, end quote. Keep an eye on the 4 states. Keep an eye on the 4 senators. Keep an eye on the 14-day timeline before the first phase of the Frankfurt Agreement begins operational implementation. Keep an eye on the 21-day timeline before the European Free Trade Association completes its ratification of the Zurich Agreement. Keep an eye on the trading desks of the 3 Wall Street institutions whose internal notes circulated within hours of the cancellation. Because what those trading desks are positioning around is the position the American manufacturing base will be operating from for the next decade. Keep an eye on what does not get announced, because the things that did not get announced are the things that mattered. The meeting cancellation will be remembered as the moment the American side admitted, by the act of cancellation, that it no longer had anything to bring to the table. The 2 signatures that were collected 48 hours before the cancellation will be remembered as the architecture that replaced the table. The architecture does not care whether the meeting is rescheduled. The architecture does not care whether a future meeting produces a future framework. The architecture is, in the technical and operational sense of the word, finished. What comes after it is the period during which the consequences of its completion become visible, and the consequences of its completion will be visible for a long time. The meeting that was canceled was the meeting that did not need to be held. The meeting that did not need to be held was the meeting Canada had already replaced. The replacement is the story. The cancellation is just the moment the replacement became impossible to ignore.